It's been the subject of argument for years. Who is the greatest Super Bowl champion of all time? Well, thankfully, you now have America's Game in your life to help you answer that question. Rich Eisen, pleased to be joined with the esteemed historian and filmmaker of NFL films, Steve Sabol, to talk about America's Game and how in the world this question of who the greatest Super Bowl champion of all time is going to be answered over the next several months. Steve, tell us about America's Game.
Well, America's Game is 40 one-hour documentaries about the 40 Super Bowl champions. And each is a story told by three members or coaches of the team. We interview three players, and it's sort of a combination of the epic and the intimate. It's their story of the season blended with all of our action footage.
And starting the Friday after Thanksgiving on NFL Network, one by one, we will be counting down the top 20 greatest Super Bowl champions of all time as voted upon by whom?
The mother of all football panels. This is originally the fans were going to do it, but I felt that fans will vote with their heart, not with their head. So we wanted to accumulate the greatest panel of football experts, not only experts, but observers, historians, statisticians, former players, coaches, general managers, scouts, and have them look at that ballot and have them select what they thought were the 20 greatest Super Bowl champions.
The ballot in question being this very piece of paper that I hold right here in my hot little hands, America's Game, the Super Bowl champions ballot, and everybody had to place either a 10 down to a 1 next to the team, and then you went back and
then,
did the math.
We saw some of the ballots, and we said, geez, how can this guy vote like this, and this guy doesn't have the Steelers, and this guy picks the... So we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to get into the minds of the decision makers and hear them explain and justify their decisions?
Well, let's meet the decision makers right here and now.
Here.
We sat down with more than half of our blue ribbon panel and gave the voters back their ballots so they could review how they ranked their top 10 teams.
To refresh your memory, as they say, when you're on the witness stand.
Hey, that's my handwriting.
I can't remember what I did here.
What did I do with the 85 Bears? I had them number 2.
Well, I didn't vote for any of the Cowboy teams, to tell you the truth, now that I look at it.
You got a pretty good ballot here compared
It's a great
to some
ballot.
of these other guys.
It's a great ballot. Well, they don't know what they're talking about.
I feel really good about this. I feel great about this, actually.
Nobody probably felt better than Steelers coach Bill Cowher, whose team won a Super Bowl after he filled out his ballot.
When you hand this thing out again, it'll be nice to see the 2005 Pittsburgh Steelers will be down at the bottom of that list. You need one more team down there to make the columns complete.
The ballots themselves were unbelievable. No two looked alike. Some were perfectly neat, like Rick Tellender's.
I would have gotten an A for penmanship from my second grade teacher, I think, here.
New York radio host Mike Francesa's ballot was a complete mess.
Well, that's because I crossed out. Because in the beginning, I thought we were ranking teams based on a different preference. I actually took them the other way from 10 down to rather than 1. So I had to scribble it all out and then start all over again.
The Hall of Fame's Joe Horrigan was the only panelist to include an apology on his ballot to the late, great Hank Stram.
I'm an old AFL brat to begin with. So it's so important, you know, when the Chiefs won that Super Bowl. But it was kind of one of these things where I'm saying, you know, Hank, I got to look at these other teams.
Chris Berman couldn't pick just 10 teams, so he went with 11.
You can't end on a tie?
Oh, yeah, you can. It's 40 years, so I'm still giving you 11.
Clearly, choosing among champions is a daunting task. There were as many voting strategies as there were voters.
You don't necessarily start thinking about number 10. You start thinking about number 1.
Were you kind of a one-trick pony, or were you a team that was capable of defeating an opponent in 4 or 5 different ways? And to me, that's a sign of greatness.
I don't rank them according to which team I thought was better than the other. I rank them in order of the impact that they made on me when those games were played.
Which team would any team not want to play today? And that's how you do the ballot. You say, there's a team on here that nobody would want to see in the playoffs.
Probably number 1 are who are the coaches. I did put a fellow by the name of Dick Vermeil. Won the Super Bowl in St. Louis. Not a lot of objectivity here. Subjectivity.
I really think sometimes we fall in love with what was. You know, the long arching, high pass of Joe Montana, Bart Starr and the vapor coming out of his mouth. It's almost pounded into you. Love the old stuff, respect the old stuff. And the way I just tried to do this is I said, okay, look, if the 97 Broncos played the 70 Baltimore Colts, who would win this game?
Perhaps the most intriguing approach was adopted by Marty Schottenheimer, who's coached against half the teams on the list.
I called a number of NFL coaches or former coaches, and I talked to Joe Gibbs, and I talked to Don Shula, and I talked to Bill Walsh, just to kind of get their perspectives. Don, as you probably know, is hysterical because, there could only be one best team of all time. I mean, how can you be better than perfect? 17-0. And I said, I'm not debating it. Give me some insight.
Few panelists had more insight than Dallas Morning News columnist Rick Gosselin, who had already ranked all of the Super Bowl champions for his newspaper in 2004.
It's not as hard as you think, because I stacked them up statistically, where they ranked in offense, where they ranked defense, the number of Hall of Famers, the number of Pro Bowlers. It's easy to sort out the cream of the crop. I mean, you could put together the top 20 fairly easily. It was sorting out 21 through 40 that was a difficult part.
Here's my only cop-out. If you gave me this list tomorrow and didn't show me who I had chosen before, the only thing I could guarantee you would be the same would be the Bears.
Do you enjoy this kind of thing?
Yeah, I love these kind of things.
You know what? I don't like these things that much.
I loved every minute of it.
It's great. I mean, it's because it's not something that you ever sit down and think about in totality.
I enjoy doing it. It makes me think. And it's good to be able to think when you're in your late 70s.
I'm like the perfect generation to do this because I'm just old enough that I can remember the first Super Bowl, but barely. I was like 7 years old, but every year since, it's been a part of my life.
It's a pain in the ass.
That card, Jerry Eisenberg, Steve. he's one of a handful of people, including yourself, who have been to every single Super Bowl, right? Mm-hmm. So of course he's got to be on this panel, whether he likes it or not. Who did you ask to be on the panel that turned you down?
One person turned us down, Peyton Manning. And I thought Peyton would be a great choice because of all of today's current players, he is truly a student of the game and its history. But he wrote me back a nice letter, and he just said that he felt that already he was playing on a team which he considered one of the best of all time, and that they had Super Bowl aspirations, and that he would feel uncomfortable voting on it.
I love it. He sent you a handwritten note. That's nice. Pretty classy. So on this very show, we're going to talk about which 20 teams made the cut for the documentary portion of the series that's to start again Friday after Thanksgiving and run up to the Super Bowl. Therefore, we have to let everybody know who was in, I guess, the 40 in the respect that anybody that played before Super Bowl era was not eligible for this.
The 58 Colts, Paul Brown's great Cleveland Browns, Bobby Lane's Lions, and in fact, probably the greatest of the Lombardi teams is not included, and that's the 1962 Packers.
Because that was before the Super Bowl era. So only, again, Super Bowl teams are included in America's game. And on this show tonight, we're going to reveal the 20 teams that made the cut decade by decade. We might as well start with Lombardi's decade.
Right. I mean, we have to start with the team whom the trophy is named after their coach.
That's right. But before it was actually named after the coach in the 60s. Take a look.
On the one hand, you've got Zeus and Apollo in Greek mythology. On the other hand, you've got Lombardi and Starr. That's the way that I look at those great Packers teams, and I think a lot of people do.
It's the Vince Lombardi Trophy. That's what they award. You have to have the Packer team somewhere in that top group.
It was a tough call, but I think that they were the team that I think was the best of the modern era.
No one disputes Green Bay's greatness. The question is whether they were still great when the '66 Packers cruised past the Chiefs in Super Bowl I, or when the '67 Packers steamrolled the Raiders in Super Bowl II.
The 62 Packers was the greatest team I've ever seen. I think they could have beaten anybody, anytime, anywhere. I mean, Bart Starr and Lombardi, Jim Taylor, Herb Adderley, Willie, they had, that team had 10 Hall of Famers. They were the best team I've ever seen. By the time they got to the Super Bowl, they were on fumes. That was the same players at the end of their careers.
Ray Nitschke limping into the end zone and Bart Starr lunging over the goal line to win the Ice Bowl were iconic images. But they were also the final images of a dynasty.
They won the NFL that second year through the sheer willpower of Vince Lombardi.
I think he willed that last team. But you had to get the Packers in there. You had to get Lombardi in there, even though his greatest teams to me were the earlier teams.
The panel agreed. The 66 Packers are the first entry on the America's Game Top 20. But what about the next champions? Joe Namath and the '68 Jets changed football history with their victory over the Colts. But do they really rank among the best teams in history?
It's historically important. That's why I had them at number 10. Maybe other teams could line up with a better cast of characters. But I credited the achievement, and I felt that deserved a place on here.
I think that the historic value has put them up here when, as a team, they're probably somewhere among Super Bowl winners, probably somewhere in the 30s.
What carried the Jets in people's memories, they won. They were the first to win. Not as important at all as the Kansas City Chiefs, who won the next one. Because the Kansas City Chiefs proved it wasn't a fluke.
Indeed, it was the '69 Chiefs, not the Jets, who cracked the top 20 with their defeat of the Vikings in Super Bowl IV.
I mean, Kansas City killed Minnesota. They were much better. You can argue to this day about the Jets and the Colts. The Chiefs and the Vikings was a mismatch.
Coming to Garrett on a trap, touchdown!
That team was a team before its time. I mean, some of those players, the Willie Laniers and the Bobby Bells and linebackers, 6'5", 6'6", 245, 50 pounds who can run.
I'm not so sure that the best defense that ever played in a Super Bowl wasn't the '69 Chiefs. That's the only defense in the history of the Super Bowl to lead across the board in defensive categories. Total defense, scoring defense, rushing defense, passing defense.
When we saw that personnel on that team, I mean, I know that it demoralized our coaching staff. They had an all-star team.
Coming up next, the Steelers, the Dolphins, the Raiders, the Cowboys, the '70s. Next on America's Game.
Welcome back to America's Game. Rich Eisen along with Steve Sable as we are revealing the top 20 Super Bowl teams of all time as voted upon by a panel this man put together. Now let's pass on to the 70s here. I mean, this is the decade I know
this
you're
is
really
the golden era of dynasties. And first of all, you've got the Dolphins, who... And a dynasty has to be characterized by a specific style of play. So you've got the Dolphins, who were the ground game and the zone defense. Then you had Al Davis's Raiders, and it wasn't enough to just win. It was burn the crops, poison the water, strip the corpses, annihilation. Right. Then you had America's team, the Cowboys, just the exact opposite. The button down, everything was strategy.
Corporate.
Very corporate. And then, of course, the fourth was the Tyrannosaurus Rex of dynasties, the Pittsburgh Steelers.
And it's interesting to me to see where people place the Dolphins, the undefeated Dolphins.
If Winston Churchill wrote about the Dolphins, he would say they were criticized by many, praised by few, but defeated by none.
I love it. Winston Churchill. Only one man can actually quote that on America's Game, and it's right here. Let's take a look at the 70s, starting with Winston's team.
Well, only one of these teams, of these 39 Super Bowl champions, finished the season without a loss. Only one finished perfectly.
The Dolphins have won Super Bowl VII, have completed the greatest season in NFL history. 17-0 says it all. The best team ever in professional football.
So the undefeated, perfect Miami Dolphins of Don Shula and the no-name defense, they got to be one. Now after that, we can get into a debate.
What they did for that season was just astounding. But I can't put them number one. I just can't.
How can you not look at that undefeated Miami team and put them anywhere but the top of this list? That's what this is about, perfection.
They were such a good football team, but there was a reason why they were called the no-name defense.
Just like you take your fingers and put them together like that. They're like fingers in a glove. Were they the best team ever? Of course not. Not at all.
I did not dispute Don's contention that how can you be better than 17-0 or perfect, as it were.
I give them props for going through it undefeated and for being perfect and doing what no other team has ever done. But if you're asking me if they were to line up against all 39 of these champions, how would they fare? I think they'd lose quite a few.
The 72 Dolphins played most of the season without their Hall of Fame starting quarterback, Bob Griese. Number 15, Earl Morrall, held down the fort for 9 straight wins while Griese was out with a broken leg.
This is the one that, to me, puts them over top as a team. They won with 2 quarterbacks. They had an injury to their star quarterback and still didn't lose a game.
But still, who you beat is an important consideration in evaluating a team. And that Dolphins team during the regular season played only 2 teams with winning records the entire season. And each of those teams was 8-6. They were underdogs going into the Super Bowl. So it's not just my perception sitting here all these years later.
None of our voters saw more of the 72 Dolphins than Hammer and Hank Goldberg, who covered the team as a local reporter.
You know, I don't think you have to be undefeated to be the best team in history. And that's why I took the 73 team over the 72 team.
That's right. According to Hank, the 72 Dolphins were not as good as the 73 Dolphins, who beat the Vikings in Super Bowl VIII.
They played a tougher schedule, and in that Super Bowl game, they just dominated Minnesota. That team just got better the next year, I thought.
Don't just take Hank's word for it. Take Don Shula's.
The question is, do I think my team is better than it was a year ago? There's no question about it. I think that we're a better football team than we were a year ago at this time.
The 72 Dolphins did beat out the 73 team and made our top 20. But were they really the greatest Super Bowl champion? Were they even the greatest team of the 70s?
In this business, you've thought about these sorts of things for years. And my thinking for many years has been those Pittsburgh Steelers teams.
When you take a chunk of 5-6 years, I just don't think there's ever has been nor ever will be a team better than the Pittsburgh Steelers.
If you pinned me against the wall and asked me the greatest football team I have ever seen, and that goes for the 50s and 60s, and even considering the 62 Packers, I would say that Steeler dynasty. I mean, where they have 9 Hall of Famers.
The mystique that they had on that defense, you've got to have your middle linebacker not have any teeth. Then you got Big Mean Joe in the middle of the line. Then you've got this physical corner, Mel Blount.
Personal favorite was Jack Ham. You know, I mean, and there's a Hall of Fame guy, but he was just a guy, you know, on defense. That team was loaded.
I always loved quarterbacks who could sling it. I mean, just step back and heave it. And that's what I thought about when I saw Bradshaw throwing to Swan and Stallworth.
He pulls it in at the 30, the 20.
You know, he was awesome. The whole offense was awesome.
The Steelers of the 70s are like a fine wine. Everyone has a favorite vintage. All 4 of the Pittsburgh teams received multiple votes, but it was the 75 and 78 teams who made the America's Game top 20.
The first Super Bowl I covered was Super Bowl X, and that was a team. I think that's still my favorite Super Bowl of all time. That Steeler team, 11 of the 22 starters went to the Pro Bowl.
In 75, the Steelers were still one of the league's youngest teams. By 78, they were seasoned and savvy.
To me, I like the idea of having a quarterback at full power than I do the early Steeler teams when you don't have the quarterback in his full flower.
Makes a circus catch in the end zone.
Only one of our voters didn't include any of the Steeler teams among his top 10.
I just don't think they were all that good.
I mean, and that's a terrible thing for me to say, and I'll get every Pittsburgh fan in the country looking for me, but my impressions of the Steelers in those years is that it was a very good team that I didn't ever consider bordering on greatness. And that's me.
Moving on.
One of my favorite trivia questions, actually, that most people don't get right is what NFL coach with more than 5 years service has the best winning percentage in the history of the league? And numbers 2 through 5, anybody would guess, because you're going to find Vince Lombardi and George Halas and Don Shula. But the winningest coach in the history of the league is John Madden.
John Madden's Raiders had just one problem.
Couldn't win the big one, and everybody connected with the organization labored under that castigation that they couldn't win the big one.
In '76, the Raiders finally knocked off the Steelers. They lost only one game and demolished the Vikings in Super Bowl XI. Our panelists dared not leave them off the top 20. In the entire decade of the '70s, only one NFC team won the Super Bowl. America's team. Tom Landry's Cowboys finished on top in '71 and '77.
There are only two teams in history, in the Super Bowl history, that ranked first in both offense and defense. 72 Dolphins and the 77 Cowboys.
The '77 Cowboys featured the Doomsday Defense and a rookie running back named Tony Dorsett. Their predecessors topped the Dolphins in Super Bowl VI. Both made our list. So who was the team of the '70s? Well, who better to answer that question than Tom Jackson, whose Denver Broncos beat the Steelers and the Raiders in the '77 playoffs before succumbing to the Cowboys in Super Bowl XII.
I really had to fight the battle between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the undefeated Miami Dolphins. The Dolphins won out just by virtue of the fact that in that time period, with all those great football teams, if you're able to run through a season and not lose a game, then you're the best team to ever play.
When we return, Walsh, Gibbs, Parcells, Ditka, the men who ruled the '80s on America's Game.
Welcome back to America's Game. If you're just joining us, we've already gone through the '60s and '70s as to which Super Bowl teams from those decades have made our top 20 Super Bowl teams of all time. America's Game is going to be counting that down, 20 down to 1, throughout the fall. And Steve, let's get to the '80s. Your impressions.
The '80s, we have two teams, Rich. You have the 49ers dynasty, 15 years, 5 Super Bowl champions, never had less than 10 wins in a season. But right in the middle of that run, you have the '85 Bears.
It is my belief, after following this league all these years, that when you get a guy who can really coach, when they have that perfect synergy, coach and quarterback at the right time, they're pretty much unbeatable.
58 seconds remaining at the 6-yard line of the Dallas Cowboys.
We're going to call a sprint option. He's going to break up and break into the corner. Okay, you got it? The right will clear. Let's go.
Montana rolling out the right, looking toward the end zone, throwing under pressure, throws his pass, caught by Clark, and a touchdown for the 49ers!
2 weeks after Dwight Clark made the catch, the '81 49ers won the Super Bowl, kicking off their 15-year run of excellence. By 1984, the 49ers had nearly perfected their West Coast offense. They became the first team ever to win 18 games in a season and dismantled the Dolphins in Super Bowl XIX. The '84 Niners are the first of 3 San Francisco entries in the top 20.
For the vast majority of writers, it's about dealing with the people and the personalities, okay? Because that's what we know better. We're not coaches, we're not players, so we focus on the people.
So you're here.
The Niners, with that scripted, beautiful, orchestrated Bill Walsh offense, made a lot of us who write about this game pay closer attention to the X's and O's.
The 49ers were so good that they won 2 Super Bowls and then added the greatest wide receiver in history, Jerry Rice. By '89, George Seifert had taken over as head coach for Bill Walsh, but the Niners might have been better than ever. Joe Montana completed over 70% of his passes in '89, and San Francisco defeated its 3 postseason opponents by a margin of 126-26. The only question was whether the '89 49ers were even better than the '84 team.
I'm still debating that one. The fact that Jerry Rice was on the '89 Niners and they weren't going to be touched. Joe Montana was great in '84 already, but he was, even if it's possible, more at the peak of his game in '89.
Unlike the 49ers, the Chicago Bears only won 1 Super Bowl. But those '85 Bears also left an indelible mark on the game.
My first year coaching was in 1985, and I was a special teams coach. We opened up against the Chicago Bears, and the opening kickoff that the Cleveland Browns had was returned for a touchdown. So that's how I was indoctrinated to the National Football League in coaching, and so they earned the #1 spot on this list.
They beat us so badly. I mean, I can literally remember sitting there on the bench and looking up and just watching the scoreboard for when it was time to go back in, because it was never a punt. It was always a touchdown, and then we, kick off, and then we go back in the game.
It's interesting how so many people outside of Chicago sort of found that team irresistible. They were entertaining. It was a smart team. They ran their mouths all the time. They were colorful. They cut this ridiculous record that was nominated for a Grammy, don't ask me why. And they just beat the hell out of people.
With Buddy Ryan's 46 defense annihilating offenses and Walter Payton running over defenses, the Bears matched the Niners' record of 18-1.
Even the one game they lost in Miami, they had a horrible game plan. They had coaches fighting in the locker room at halftime, and they still probably have a chance to win that game if Marino doesn't bounce a ball off Dan Hampton's helmet early in the 3rd quarter. So for one season, I think they may have been the most dominant team in the history of the game.
I mean, a shutout in the playoff game is pretty impressive. And the Bears get 2 shutouts in the playoffs. Shutting out the Giants, even if the Giants were to win it all. And then shutting out a very good Rams team that beat the 49ers for the division title that year, and then just crushing the Patriots. The Patriots had minus 19 yards in a half of football in the Super Bowl. That is dominance.
The '85 Bears were a no-brainer for the top 20, but their failure to make it back to the Super Bowl has left heads scratching.
People hold that against them when they look back at Super Bowl champions. They want to know, well, why didn't they win 2 or 3 if they were so great? And clearly they should have.
I don't want the Bears to take offense to this. I mean, because they were an outstanding team, but I just thought that they were more a product of their scheme than they were the guys who were playing the scheme.
There is one other explanation for Chicago's demise. Their competition was pretty darn good. In '86, Lawrence Taylor's Giants broke through, finishing the regular season 14-2.
The '86 Giants kind of fascinate me because they followed 2 of the most dominant teams in history, 2 who made my list, the '84 Niners and the '85 Bears, made my top 5, I should say. And I don't think they were as good as those 2 teams.
I followed the Giants as a kid, and then I ventured out west. And I'm sorry to say this, but it's true. There's an absolute East Coast bias towards some of these East Coast teams. And those '86 Giants, they were really good. They were as solid as their quarterback, Phil Simms. Phil Simms is not in the Hall of Fame, but he was such a good quarterback. And that's the way I think of that team, as a really good team. But one of the all-time teams? I don't think so.
The '86 Giants, I could see someone leaving them off the list. I wouldn't have a problem. But I saw that team, and that team knew how to win games. They won a lot of close games.
Through 14 games, Big Blue outscored their opponents by an average of 6 points. They won their final 5 games by an average of 26.
By the end of the season, they were a juggernaut team. And then they got in the postseason, and they buried the Niners 49-3. They shut out the Redskins 17-0, and they beat Denver 39-20. So they were dominant in the postseason.
He's in the end zone. He got him. Safety.
In Super Bowl 21, the merely good Phil Simms was excellent. He completed 22 of 25 passes in an MVP performance, leaving little doubt that the Giants belong among the greatest Super Bowl champions. There is greater doubt about the Redskins. Joe Gibbs' team won 3 Super Bowls from 82 to 91, but they did it with a formula that left many of our panelists wondering how good the Redskins really were.
It's easily the most fascinating of the 80s teams because the team changed so dramatically. So many of those players came and went. 3 quarterbacks, no one's ever done that. Had 3 different running backs. I mean, from John Riggins to, Tim Smith and Ernest Biner. Tim Smith, where is he? 204 yards in the Super Bowl. Don't know where he is.
The 83 Redskins scored more points than any team had ever scored. But that team lost to the Raiders in the Super Bowl. And while the 83 Raiders made our top 20, the 82 and 87 Redskins failed to impress our voters.
I don't know why that is. Is it because they won with 3 different quarterbacks? Is it because they just didn't have any memorable personalities except for Riggo?
Here's another theory. Both the 82 and 87 seasons were shortened by player strikes.
Al Davis, I think, has said it the best. In some years, you can just steal Super Bowls. In 2 of the 3 years, I think they stole Super Bowls.
But in 1991, there was no strike. And that season, the Redskins were unquestionably dominant. They won their first 11 games and outscored their opponents by more than 16 points a game, the largest average margin of victory of any Super Bowl champion.
Washington Redskins.
That team was a dominant team that season. They clobbered everybody in the playoffs. They were just really good.
The Redskins capped their greatest season with a 37-24 shellacking of Buffalo in the Super Bowl, earning their place as the only Washington team to make the America's Game Top 20.
Welcome back to America's Game. This man, Steve Sabol, has put together an esteemed panel of experts to try and decide who the top 20 Super Bowl teams of all time are. Let's see what these guys had to say about the 90s.
Super Bowl 27 brought a familiar sight to pro football. America's team was back, and better than ever. All you had to do was ask them.
I was sitting right over this play where Michael Irvin was split out to the left, and he pointed to where he was going, and he still beat the corner. It was like Ali saying, "I'm going to knock you out now," and he did. That team had a swagger about it.
If you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk.
The Cowboys were more than talk. They were the first team ever to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 seasons. Only one of those teams made our top 20, but at least one of our panelists makes the case that the 92 Cowboys were the best team ever.
There were 17 players in that team that went on to become Pro Bowlers. I think they could have played with the Steelers of the 70s, with the Packers of the 60s, Niners of the 80s, because they were at the front end of their primes. They had young legs. They had the NFL's #1 defense that year, and they had the triplets.
Handoff, Smith, big hole in right tackle to the 40, and he's gone.
And what they did to that Buffalo team was a devastating Super Bowl performance.
The Cowboys' 52-17 defeat of the Bills was as thorough as any in Super Bowl history. But it wasn't just Buffalo that Dallas dominated. It's a testament to the greatness of those Cowboys that the rivals they beat up on in the first half of the 90s also made our top 20. After consecutive defeats to Dallas in the NFC Championship game, Steve Young led the 49ers to their 5th Lombardi Trophy with one of the greatest offenses in NFL history.
How can I leave out Steve Young when he's completing like 8 out of 10 passes? When Jerry Rice is just catching everything, when the offense is all in sync. That's where it becomes almost like, all right, I got to throw out all 1 through 10. I got to start all over again. And I could probably come up with 1 through 10 and not even include any of the 10 teams that I have right here.
In '96, the Packers emerged from the Cowboys' shadow, becoming the first team since the '72 Dolphins to score the most points in the league and allow the fewest.
I felt that they were as dominant a team in that year as any that I'd come across since the Bears.
That Packers team played a slate of opponents that finished with over a 500 record, which is very rare. There have been only 2 such Super Bowl champions since 1990. There's another team where you might make the case that maybe they should have won more than 1 Super Bowl with Favre.
The Packers' reign as champions was torpedoed in 1997 by John Elway and the Broncos. Denver did win a 2nd consecutive Super Bowl in '98, but the Broncos had their share of detractors on our panel.
The middle of the field, Rod Smith's got it. Here we go, 30, 20, 15, 10, Denver touchdown.
I thought the Broncos caught the right situation. They beat a Green Bay team that was overconfident in the Super Bowl. They beat an Atlanta team that probably was over its head in the Super Bowl.
They, to me, were the best team at a time when I wasn't thrilled with the quality of play in the league. These teams that are winning now don't excite me as all-time greats the way some of the former teams did, and the Broncos were right at the beginning of that.
But you can only play the teams on your schedule. And in '98, the Broncos beat the first 13 opponents on theirs.
Cuts back again. He will walk into the end zone. Touchdown, Denver.
Terrell Davis rushed for over 2,000 yards as Denver became only the 6th team to score 500 points in a season.
How many tackles did he break on that baby?
When you look at the Denver Broncos, what do you see? And I thought, I see John Elway. I see the best receiving tight end in the history of football. I see Terrell Davis, who had he had a longer career would have no doubt been a Hall of Famer. When you look at the skill players here, I clearly can see how great they were.
But it was probably the enduring allure of number 7 that assured the Broncos a place in the America's Game Top 20.
How do you not have John Elway at his finest, at his clutch finest in this?
When we return, the final 2 selections on the America's Game Top 20.
Welcome back to America's Game. Let's see what the esteemed panel of experts of Steve Sables here had to say about the teams from the current decade.
A funny thing happened to the NFL at the turn of the century. A group of teams with unimpressive pedigrees and unheralded quarterbacks won 4 straight Super Bowls. It was as if the pro football world had been turned upside down.
I don't know what to make of the Rams. I mean, it was sort of arena football come to the NFL. And I know that sounds like I'm trying to diminish them. I'm not. It just looked different. It felt different. It didn't feel like pro football felt to those of us who grew up becoming addicted to the game in the 60s. In the context of Super Bowl teams, where do you put the Rams? What do you make of them?
Our panel made enough of them to give the Rams a place on the top 20.
They were so explosive, and they were such a memorable club. I'm not a big Mike Martz fan, but I do think as they call it, the greatest show on turf that he assembled was somewhat revolutionary in the league, and so I looked at it in that context.
If the Rams were a difficult team to judge, the Patriots were downright confounding.
I remember thinking about this and saying that I've done the Patriots a disservice when I did this, because I did not include them.
The rules now, free agency, what has happened with the salary cap does not allow you anymore to have a team that can be dominant like the old teams were.
Well, I think if you took the Patriots and you compared them player to player with many of the other great Super Bowl champions, you would say the other teams were better. What the Patriots had that enabled their greatness was two things. First of all, incredible, brilliant coaching. And secondly, just wondrous clutch play. Maybe unforeseen in the previous history of Super Bowl teams.
Now he shoots it long and deep for Troy Brown. He's got it! Touchdown! And the Patriots win it overtime! Adam Vinatieri kicks it through the snow, and we're tied at 13. 15 seconds to go. The handoff to Edgerrin. He is stopped at the 1-yard line!
It looks like they weren't as dominant when the purpose of the game is not to dominate, it's to win.
The Patriots made the improbable look routine, winning not one, but 2 Super Bowls with last-second field goals. New England joined the Cowboys as the only teams to win 3 Super Bowls in 4 years and won an NFL record 21 consecutive games.
It is intercepted, picked off and heading down the left
They sealed their place among NFL dynasties in 2004 with a dominating run. And it's the 2004 Patriots that our voters selected to join the greatest teams of the Super Bowl era.
So you now know who the top 20 Super Bowl teams of all time are, as voted upon by the America's Game panel. Now all that's left, Steve Sabol, is to hear from those who lived it in a fascinating documentary series that ranks where in your history?
Right up at the top. I mean, for me, Rich, personally, this was such an invigorating project to go back and have the privilege of interviewing personally maybe 50 or 60 former players, and you go back and you do the interviews and you realize, number one, how much this sport means to every one of the players, plus what it means to have won a championship and to be part of a championship team.
And the interesting thing is, Steve, is you didn't interview the world for each one of these pieces. Only 3 people who lived the experience and who won.
These are not people who wrote about it, who reported it, who watched it. These are the people who actually created it and lived it. They're the only people that are interviewed.
And then on top of it all, the narrators for this series. You went, Oscar on us.
Well, as you know, that's been an NFL Films tradition. So we have Morgan Freeman, we've got Bruce Willis, Gene Hackman, Ed Harris, Alec Baldwin.
Fantastic.
Yeah. That's a Hall of Fame of narrators.
I think that's unbelievable. I can't wait to see it all play out again every Friday night on NFL Network up until the Super Bowl. And do you know who the #1 team is of all time as voted?
Of course I do.
You do know this?
Absolutely.
Who else knows this information?
About 6 or 7 of our producers.
So that's vaulted.
Oh, yeah.
That's
absolutely.
Vaulted. Deep down vaulted.
Yeah.
Can't get it out of you. I'm so looking forward to this, Steve.
Well, thank you for being part of the panel.
I don't know how I made it. I quite honestly don't know how I made the panel. And I'll reveal it. I voted the '85 Bears as #1 all time. Just in terms of who they were and what they were all about.
It's a good choice.
And the defense as well. Plus, I knew I couldn't go wrong. I couldn't go wrong. Of course, there's a lot of other choices. Steve, I look forward to seeing it play out.
Rich, thanks.
For Steve Sabol, on Honor, I am Rich Eisen. Thank you for watching America's Game, a countdown to history. Enjoy America's Game.